I only noticed that this morning again.
So if you go to the website, you'll see all of the information that he's done and all of his credits and stuff like that. But I just want to say that one of my undergraduate majors was linguistics. So in 2009, when a documentary came to the Salem Cinema that toured the world in an attempt to record some of the endangered languages, I was more than intrigued. By the way, did you know that there are more than 7,000 languages spoken in the world? The film did not disappoint. Dr. Anderson, who is the co-founder of Living Tongues Institute, housed here in Salem, was there in person to share his experiences while making the film and to highlight behind-the-scenes aspects of such a feat. And I call it a feat because on occasion, they would just wander the streets of a village calling out to the elders looking for speakers of languages like Chilim, for example, until someone acknowledged that they did speak that and would introduce them to a few others who did. Back then, only 5 speakers were still alive. Or noting a Bolivian language that describes the use of some 10,000 medicinal plants. Or making the ultimate sacrifice to honor customs and prove his manhood by drinking vodka or swallowing super spicy foods, and even becoming deathly ill at 14,000 feet in the remote highlands of Bolivia and relying on an herbal brew to be cured. In one place, he connected 2 individuals who had been forbidden to speak their native language and hadn't known the other existed in the town until he brought them together. That always gives me goosebumps. Since then, he has completed talking dictionaries, grammar books, children's illustrated storybooks, and journals sharing his discoveries around the world, with the world. But short of me taking up any more of his time, I'll let Dr. Gregory Anderson tell you the story in his own living tongue.
All right, yep, thank you very much. Let's see. So I'm going to frame today's presentation in the context of a new, I guess, approach to understanding what I call the ecologies of language endangerment. And this is a means to help explain where languages that are endangered are concentrated, that I call language hotspots, and why they're there, and how the different language hotspots are manifested, and what the socio-political ecology of the entire network and matrix of inter-ethnic communication and inter-ethnic dynamics that exist within a sort of political, historical context to understand the distribution of language endangerment globally. Okay. And all right, so this is Living Tongues, as Gwendolyn mentioned, my organization that is here in Salem. So roughly we're going to cover these topics, starting out with what's a language and what's an endangered language, and why they're endangered, and then where they're endangered, and then that is the global language hotspots, and then a little bit deeper into the sort of a typology of ecologies of language endangerment, mainly focusing to contextualize this on different language hotspots in Asia, but I will also touch on other parts of the world as well. So first we'll look at settlement colonies, of which there are 3, but 2 hotspots, essentially Siberia being one and the Taiwan Ryukyu Islands being another one. I'll explain why those are connected. And then there is another type of ecological context, which are under relatively recent nationalist development schemes. This is going to be found in Southeast Asia and Western Australasia, which is essentially the Philippines and Indonesia. And then I'll talk about neo-colonialist practices in South Asia. Then I'll talk somewhat about trade and exploitation colonies, looking at equatorial Africa as well as Melanesia. And then wrap up again with a sort of New World, if you will, settlement colonies, including Australia and the Americas, and then some of the things that are happening in these communities to fight back. Okay, so to start with some basic facts, everyone speaks a dialect, but we mainly only perceive others as speaking a dialect. You know, I speak this, you speak something else, okay? But we all speak a dialect, all right? This is just a fact of life, all right? So everyone has an accent and everyone speaks a dialect, okay? So what's the difference between a dialect and a language? Well, this is essentially a political issue. One famous quote by Uriel Weinreich is language is a dialect with an army and a navy. And of course, this is a bit tongue-in-cheek, but what this means, of course, is that enfranchised varieties that have power call themselves languages, and everything else that diverges in terms of words, pronunciations, or actual word choice, et cetera, are dialects of that language. Okay, so once you codify something in writing and you promote it, often through a nation-state ideological context, then you have a language, and everything else that's mutually intelligible with that is a dialect, essentially. All right, this is. So it's basically a historical, political, sociological issue, not a linguistic one. As I said, we all speak a dialect, okay? So how many languages are there? Well, we basically already heard this. There's basically roughly 7,000. No one actually knows how many languages there are in the world. There are certain countries that newly reported languages come out relatively frequently, like Nigeria. India is another country where it's very hard to get your head around how many languages there are, because the ideology associated with language versus dialect is very different in India than what I just described. So a lot of times people say they speak a dialect when in fact their language is not mutually intelligible with other ones. So. Now, the 7,000 or so languages we just saw are not evenly distributed among speakers in the world. So there are some very large languages, which there are not that many of. And then there's a whole bunch of smaller languages, and then some various medium-sized languages in between, okay? And so there's this inverse pyramid relationship where the 85 largest languages in the world are roughly spoken by 80% of the world's population, and more than half the languages of the world are spoken by less than 0.1% of the languages, people on Earth. So there's a heavy demographic skewing. So not all languages are equal, either politically, historically, or in terms of demographics. So to contextualize the distribution of language endangerment, we're going to look at three sort of main typologies of what I call these ecologies of endangerment. So they all, on some level, can probably be attributed to either direct or indirect colonial experiences. Even countries that haven't been explicitly colonized have nationalist movements that are very similar to colonialists. It just involves internal to one nation state as opposed to something from outside coming and imposing those dynamics on them. So a lot of this, so Ethiopia would be a classic example of this, where it was never colonized. I mean, there was a small part of it colonized by Italy for a brief time, but largely Ethiopia has been an independent nation, and yet modern day Ethiopian sociolinguistic dynamics are very much similar to colonialism, and this is what I call internal neocolonialism. Okay. So basically the consequences, broadly speaking, are that a huge number of the world's languages are either being lost or have been lost. A very small number of languages have been created through language contact, so-called Pidgins and Creole languages, which arose through contact specifically. But there's a very small number of those compared to the very large number that have been lost. And then also in the ones that exist, there's been often very elaborate restructuring that has happened, so that there's just a convergence on the sort of dominant language types that changes the features of the minority languages towards structures that look more like the majority languages. Now, that's getting into linguistic details. I'm not going to really bore you with that kind of stuff in this type of presentation, because you don't care about the case system replacing a verb agreement system, okay? Those are terms that I already know you've glazed over on. So we'll spare you the linguistic details, but linguists, language scientists like myself like that kind of stuff because it's interesting and quirky. But just to put the language extinction crisis into some contextualization of other extinction crises, we'll see that it's actually, languages are much more endangered than species in the world for the most part. So you see, fortunately, that we're less than 20% of most things are at risk still, although, that's rapidly expanding in our polluted and industrializing world. But languages, even conservative estimates will put it at 40%. It could be as high as 80 or 90%. Okay, so it's on a different level. Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about language endangerment. So here's a good question. What is an endangered language? There is a technical definition of endangered language. Now, endangerment is a continuum, and not all languages that would be called endangered in a broad sense would be endangered in a technical sense. So technically a language is endangered if children are no longer learning it, okay? Because once that's not being passed on through the generations, it's essentially on the clock to die. That's unless major efforts are put forth to reverse that trend, okay? Now there are languages that are still being acquired by children, but the social, historical, ecological conditions aren't favorable to that being maintained long into the future. So these are languages we'll call threatened or vulnerable, but they're not technically endangered. Threatened and vulnerable languages, the reversal of these processes can be more effectively implemented, the measures that you can take. Once a language is endangered, and we'll see that there's a scale of endangerment once you're on endangerment, then it gets increasingly more difficult to realistically restore functions or domains of use for these languages, okay? So here's really a big question. Why do languages become endangered? So it's essentially a complex set of psychosocial factors, but it often boils down to how different codes of communication or languages are valued in a multilingual context. So it's essentially a conflict of ideology of whether or not these languages have a value, however that's interpreted. So yes, the way to think of it is languages become endangered when there's a conflict between the attitude towards or the ideologies associated with the use of particular languages. And languages, of course, are intimately associated with identity, and so that usually reflects some kind of bias in these societies against certain people's identity, towards other people's identity. And one of the most obvious ways that people can change vectors of discrimination is to abandon a language that's becoming a problem for them. They can't. Religion would be another way they could, shift religions, but skin color, these type of things are things you can't change, basically. So, people can try to assimilate to certain things when they know they can't change certain other things. So, abandoning a language when you have strong pressure against it and people are discriminating against you for using it is a sort of logical response to a hostile ecology. So I mentioned that there's a scale of endangerment. So sometimes we'll see some numbers here, and I'll give this graph more than once. But the lower the number, the more endangered it is. So the closer to zero, the worse off a language is, okay? So above this, we could have a language like English, which would be well above 6. Maybe on this scale, it would be 10. It's an expanding, healthy language, expanding into all kinds of different domains globally. So, and then you have various other, languages that would be at various stages. We're only going to think about languages from the levels 6 and lower, so threatened down to moribund. Moribund is like the Chulim language that was mentioned at the beginning, which had 5 speakers 20 years ago. It's down to 1. So this is a situation that's, Locally endangered, and then endangered. Yeah, sorry, the yellow, that was not a good choice for a white background. And then, so essentially you have threatened, locally endangered, endangered, and then locally seriously endangered. So some places it's seriously endangered, some places less so. And then seriously endangered and moribund. This puts it into some other terms here. What do these terms actually mean? Well, I mentioned before, threatened means the ecological or demographic factors. So it could be a very large language that's in a very low status, like Javanese in Indonesia, which has 75 million speakers, but is still threatened because Bahasa Indonesia is so widely and heavily promoted within the state of Indonesia. Or it can be demographically threatened. You could have 100% of the community speak the language, but there's only 600 of them or 400 of them, right? So that means like, and demographically threatened is real. So in 1995, on the north coast of New Guinea, an earthquake occurred and a tsunami happened, and 4 language communities that were entirely stable were wiped out overnight. Like every single member of the community was killed who was in the village because the entire village was destroyed. As it turns out, there were like a handful of people from each of these communities that happened to be away from the village that night. So there were 4 or 5, but they're dispersed. Their community doesn't exist anymore. So generally, sudden glotticide like that, where a language disappears very, very quickly, it doesn't occur very often. It's usually a slow and gradual process of assimilation and shift. Basically you can think of if children aren't learning it, so that means the parents might be the youngest speakers, and then the next sort of level of endangerment is grandparents being the youngest speakers, and then great-grandparents being the youngest speakers. And you can put that into context, understanding that if 80-year-olds are the youngest set of speakers, the language is unlikely to endure for very much longer, okay? 20 max years probably. Now, there's different numbers and counting this. You can never have just like we don't know how many languages there are, we don't actually know how many endangered languages there are either. But here's one count that happened that I did a few years ago. It's assuredly out of date now, but it was accurate about in 2020-ish. Okay, there's probably some languages that are moribund there that are extinct now, and some of the other ones have shifted category, et cetera, et cetera. You can see, fortunately, still threatened is the largest group, which means the language group that has the most likely restorative measures that can be taken to help it. Seriously endangered and moribund languages are in really bad condition, and very little is going to make that different. Okay, so, why should we care? This is a question only people who speak majority languages would ever ask, first of all. Every language is valuable to its community of speakers in terms of emblem of identity, a storehouse of community history, and they have a moral right to keep it, all right? People do not have the rights to impose their own identities on others in an abstract moral sense. From a linguistics perspective, of course, these languages often have very interesting features that help us understand the nature of cognition and human genius and other things that some majority languages would tell you don't exist, but here we find them in these minority languages. So basically, this is a reason for people like myself to engage in language documentation, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that towards the end. So get what we can now, because here's one thing we know. Nothing, if you have no information about a language, it's as if it never existed. We can't even imagine what the value of potential future innovations in technology or neuroscience or whatever that data that we collect now might help feed, okay? But if we don't collect it, we know it will do nothing. All right, so like there is a real imperative for people in the field of linguistics to do this. Not all linguists agree with this, incidentally. They're like, no, I'm just going to, worry about the syntax of Spanish and, which is a topic that could be explored well in 100 and 200 years. Meanwhile, dozens, if hundreds of languages are disappearing. So it's not something I think is a great use of time for people trained in linguistics. There are also a lot of reasons that you probably have never even considered. And that is I'll just give you two examples. So one in the economic, socio-demographic realm and one in the biomedical realm. So starting with the latter, in the biomedical realm, bilinguals on average have about 4.5 years later for the onset of dementia than monolinguals do, okay? So the knock on both personal within family context and economic understanding of that is, my mother has dementia, so I do understand what this means on a personal level and also on an economic level, like how difficult it is when you have a family member in this situation, all right? So if you could have 4.5 years less of that, and the only thing you need to have is people be bilingual. I mean, that's a pretty low effort for a pretty big knock-on. The other issue is in a longitudinal study that was done among Cherokee immersion school students, what you saw was often there's a fear in the United States of multilingualism, and they fear that if they don't go to school in English and only learn English, they're not going to have English. Well, that's nonsensical. You don't understand the ecology of English in the United States to think that everyone who grows up in the United States and goes through schooling in the United States learns English, okay? And they become fluent in English. It's whether they have another language is the issue. And when you have this sort of, comfort with your identity, there are real benefits. So the Cherokee students that went through the immersion versus the ones that didn't, you have higher graduation rates, higher average salaries, lower incarceration rates, lower drug and alcohol use, lower rates of domestic violence. So you have every social demographic thing you want with just the fact that this one group was allowed to keep 2 languages and the other group wasn't, okay? So there are lots of reasons for people to care. Why now? Well, I think this is pretty straightforward. It's happening now, and we don't act now, there's not going to be a then to deal with it. So it's now or never, not now or then. Okay, so where are these languages endangered, concentrated? So because of the different social, historical, political ecologies, much like languages aren't distributed evenly across the world, much like numbers of speakers aren't distributed evenly, so too are these ecological conditions not distributed evenly across the world. So there are certain places where there are more languages at risk due to the specific historical circumstances that they found themselves in. And these areas I call global language hotspots, okay? So this is a way to prioritize research and funding initiatives. It's also a way for people to 7,000, 4,000, these are numbers people can't get their head around, okay? You have like a dozen or 2 dozen. People say, okay, that I can get my head around. That's a comfortably small list. I can deal with it. Action can be planned. So it's also a promotional metaphor, I will confess, okay? It's grounded in science, but there is a promotionality to it that exists. So specifically, I consider these 3 factors when determining what constitutes a language hotspot. So that is a relatively high average level of endangerment. I think that's fairly easy to get your head around. Also, relatively low level of documentation. So what we know about the languages of the area is, relatively speaking, relatively low, okay? And then third, this is one that is a little more technical, linguistic, but that's where you get higher concentrations of diverse types of languages. So languages that are belong to different language families, like, English and Chinese don't belong to the same language family. Okay, so like this is like what I mean by, so when you have these things, so if you map the world according to these 3 factors independently, then you come across with about 2 dozen areas that are priority areas. So that's how I created the language hotspots. Basically, this I'll go into detail here. We'll talk a little bit about Siberia and North America, and very tangentially about Australia, not really about the Nuba Hills or eastern Brazil here, but these are all settlement colonies where language endangerment is really, really severe. Okay, so this is taking the world as a whole, where we find a concentration of these different endangered languages. Okay, so these are the global language hotspots. You can see there's a couple in the Pacific, a couple in Africa, essentially a few in North and South America, and also Asia, Eurasia. Okay. Now, looking at this map from a different perspective, again, not all hotspots are created equal. They all are achievable by those rubric that I just mentioned, but if we take now green as healthier and red as less healthy, okay? So red is the most endangered, green is more less endangered, but still endangered, threatened or endangered. We see again that there's a different type of distribution, and specifically what we find is Australia, North America, and South America, it's a lot of red, okay? These are settlement colonies. Siberia as well, although it's up there in the northeast part of the Russia there. These are also settlement colonies. And you see a couple of other ones, Taiwan, parts of New Guinea, et cetera. So these essentially where you have settlement colonization, you have the worst types of endangerment. And where you have the other types of ecology, you still have a less endangerment. That doesn't mean that there's not a catastrophic situation going on there. It's just not as bad. All right, so these are the ones that I've identified. And this key here tells you what the different sort of ecologies that have given rise to these different are. So remember, there's three ecologies. One is a settlement colony, which we were just talking about. The second one is the sort of nationalist development strategy ecology, also neo-colonialist, because those are very much neo-colonialist as well in the way the state treats the minority groups, and we'll see this in a second. And then we have the trade and exploitation colonies, which are much less frequent. There's really only two of them, and that's essentially, Equatorial Africa should have / plus. So, and Melanesia and parts of Equatorial Africa. So other parts of Equatorial Africa belong to the nationalist development schema. So yes, they were colonies in Africa, and yes, in many of these countries, French or English or Portuguese is the official language, but they were never settlement colonies except for two places. That is northern South Africa, where most of the so-called click languages are either extinct or nearly so, because that was an early settlement colony where now most of those people have shifted to Afrikaans, and in the post-apartheid world, shifting to English, but still Afrikaans is the first language of most of the former click language speakers. And another one that people don't really think about is the Nuba Hills. Now, there's a civil war going on in Sudan right now, okay? And you may have remembered 20 plus years ago when Darfur, the horror that was happening in Darfur was going on. This is because Sudan is a settlement colony of Arab speakers who have colonized non-Arab speakers, okay? The Fur people are non-Arab. The peoples that live in the Nuba Hills are non-Arab. And so the Nuba Hills is a classic settlement colony, and what we're seeing is, it's just didn't happen 200, 400 years ago, it's happening now. Okay, so this is why the situation is so grim in those areas. It's exactly what was happening in everywhere else in our own history here in the Pacific Northwest even, okay? But it's just that it happens to be able to be reported because it's in contemporary times and not in sort of, pre-modern historical times. Okay, so this basically is just another way of looking at, presenting the same information. I just had it here. We have the settlement colonies. We have the national identity construction and internal neo-colonialist scenarios, and then we have the trade or exploitation scenarios. Now, the interesting thing about here is that, okay, in the settlement colonies, basically the settlement colony language is the one that's the replacing language, right? So this would be, English in the United States, Spanish in most of Latin America, except for Brazil, where it's Portuguese, French in Quebec, okay, so think of it like that. English in Australia as well. And then, like I just mentioned, Arabic in the Nuba Hills and Afrikaans in South Africa. So it's the outside language coming in that's replacing. In the national identity construction ecologies, you have either the ethnic majority language or a constructed national language. There's two different scenarios, and that's what we see in the Philippines or in Indonesia. That's being promoted by the state and replacing other languages. And in the trade and exploitation colonies, you basically get middleman, so-called middleman languages. And those are either a ethnic group that happened to be enfranchised by the colonial period, power as sort of the colonial administrators, if you will. But mainly what it is one of these new languages, a Creole language that arose through the contact. So this would be what you find in Nigeria with the Naija, as it's called locally, but Nigerian English, or sometimes called Pidgin, although it's a Creole language, not a Pidgin. We'll talk about that in a second. But, and then in Melanesia, you essentially have, in Papua New Guinea, you have the language called Tokpisin, also locally known as Pidgin. In Solomon Islands, it's so-called Solomon's Pidgin. And in Vanuatu, Bislama. Okay, so these are all basically English lexified Creoles. Bislama has a little bit more French in it than the other ones because of the peculiar history of Vanuatu. So essentially Creole languages are what are becoming dominant in trade and exploitation colonies. So the ecologies themselves help explain what language is the replacing one as well. Okay, so like I said, just to remind you about our little scale here, it's 1 to 6, essentially you're 0. Well, you don't really map extinct languages. There's an endless number of unknown extinct languages, right? So extinct and unrecorded means, very real. We don't know they ever existed at this point. You might know or have a guess because there's words in a language you can't identify in a particular area. That might be from some lost language, So we already did this, so I think that this is just the putting into terms what these scales mean. Okay, so in Asia, as if we saw the map of Asia as a whole, it had a lot more green and yellows and oranges than it had reds. So we have, there's a lot of languages in Asia, but we still overall, so 4 is endangered. So it's just between endangered and locally endangered. So not endangered in some areas, but endangered in others. So it's still okay in Asia as a whole. So we're going to just briefly go through these 3 types within Asia. Well, really the first 2, because there aren't really trade or exploitation colonies in Asia proper. Melanesia is in the Pacific, not Asia. So yeah, we'll start with Siberia. Okay, so all of these areas and all language hotspots can be defined by a hierarchy of languages. Okay, so there's usually one at the top, and then you get increasingly large numbers of languages as you go down, except for in the particular case of here, where Siberia has a small number of completely unrecognized languages. This is all based on Soviet concepts of ethnicity, which I'll talk about in a second because it's important for a lot of other things. So anyway, we have basically big languages that are written, bigger-ish languages that have at least been given writing and have some nominal education in theory, not really in practice. And then you have the ones that aren't written, and then the ones that are unrecognized. Okay, so this is what Siberia looked like in the 17th century. It had, roughly 10 or a dozen different language families spoken in it. They occupied vast territories often. This is what's going on in Siberia these days. This is a clear-cut and a horrendously poisoned area from a smelting mine. Taiga being, just devastated. So it's, in addition to social issues, there's a lot of environmental issues happening in Siberia. This is a more accurate map from that 17th century now. So effectively what we find are languages concentrated with a handful of speakers in a small number of villages. Okay, so we've been this vast territory, vastly exceeding the size of the United States, being reduced to just a handful of villages where a handful of elderly people maintain these languages. This one is coded by Vitality Index. You'll see there's a lot of reds in here. We're going to focus on this area down here. This is where I've done a lot of field work. Okay, first language I'm going to talk to you about is Tofa.
This is Kostya Mikhaev. He is the last cognitively functional speaker of this language. But that's increasingly dubious even for him. He's in his 80s now. And this language is down to under 10 speakers. I wanted to be able to play a video just so you could hear a little bit of the language. This one, okay, cannot play media. All right, this one didn't work when we tested it, so I'll skip this. We'll talk about another one of these languages, which is Yshyr. This is one of these unrecognized languages. This is the youngest and oldest speaker of the language. She knows this. She is 60 years younger than the next youngest speaker of the language because she was raised by her grandmother who refused to speak to her in Russian. And thus, she's 100% fluent in Russian. Just like I was saying about the American school systems, it's that Russia is the same level as English is. In Russia, you're going to learn Russian. Just hopefully we can hear a little bit of this language.
Организационного бытового управления Китыш Шулерда перестройка что развалилась, но Мunda работал как бы Тонгам был.
So what you might have noticed there is that some sounded like Russian. Okay, yeah. So he was code switching with Russian wildly. That's what typically happens with end-stage languages. There, he starts a sentence in one language, he switches to Russian, he switches back to Yshyr, he switches back to Russian. So, yeah, that exactly. You could hear the end of a language in practice there. So, just wanted to show that. This is. This is one of the people who we met in the Chulim area who she denied being a speaker, but then confessed later to being one. She denied being a speaker and then confessed to being one only after being cajoled. Her own family was unaware that she knew. All right, everyone but the guy on the left is now deceased here. So I just want to hear, this is a Chulim language.
Азан вот мен сургам пистен дила кайты вот казак тилна ай пистен ай кайты вот.
So what he asked him was, in our language, we used to have names for months, like Fox Month, and then that was trying to prime those two older speakers to come up with the traditional calendar. This is the man who was in the middle's grave. So he died not long after we filmed that. This is me working with Vasya Gabov again. Okay, so the other settlement colony is in Asia is the Taiwan Ryukyu. So there are very strongly assimilationist language policies towards either Chinese or Japanese in these two areas. One of the things that's odd about this area is that they had two waves of colonization. So they had an original wave, and then they had a second, or occupation, let's say, not necessarily colonization. And during the second wave of occupation, there was a massive language shift towards the original colonizers' language. So it wasn't the original event that triggered it, but rather this sort of secondary threat. In the case of Taiwan, it was when the Japanese colonized or conquered Taiwan, and they started shifting en masse to Chinese. And in the case of the Ryukyu Islands, it was when the Americans occupied Okinawa that they decided that they were going to shift to Japanese. Okay, so it's a slightly different scenario than Siberia, but it's also not so great. One of the reasons that Taiwan is interesting is that it's the jump-off point of the entire Austronesian language family, which includes Hawaiian and most of the Pacific Island languages, and also all the way west to Madagascar, the Malagasy language, and most of the languages of Indonesia and the Philippines and stuff all belong to this large family. They all originated in Taiwan. So the Taiwan Aboriginal languages are all Austronesian, not related to Chinese, a different language family. This is a slightly more accurate, there's a handful of big languages that have survived till modern times, but you can see the coast, north and western side of the island are fully dominated by Chinese now. And this is just basically a map of the Austronesian expansion, so you can see how they started to go out. Also, Maori, also in New Zealand, belongs to this. So they got around. The Polynesians in particular were, but the Micronesians, we have a large Micronesian population here in Salem. Marshallese, these are all Austronesian languages. So yeah, Taiwan is sort of flip-flop back and forth with its policies towards Aboriginal language instruction and tolerance. You know, if they're conquered by China, it's not going to bode well. We'll see why, because China has its own issues. I'll skip this. There's like I said, it seems like every time there's a new power there. This is a dictionary of a language that's dormant or no longer has speakers in Taiwan that we've been building a dictionary for that does have recordings. So you can, even when a language has no speakers, attempt to breathe life back into them through developing resources for them. Okay, so just to give you a summary of what it's a three-part hierarchy that we find in these language in this area. So we have the majority or official language, a large common tongue, if you will, and then the sort of at the lowest level, the indigenous Aboriginal languages. So in the Ryukyu Islands, Japanese has the sort of Tokyo standard, and then it has the more sort of rural standards, and then it has the Ryukyuan languages, which in the case of Japan are distantly related to Japanese, so they are in fact related languages, but they're not very similar. They're not in any sense. They're locally considered dialects, but this is one of this dialect language political thing. They're clearly separate languages. Okay, now we're going to switch our attention to nationalist, neo-nationalist things. So all of these countries have sort of in a chain been influenced by each other, except for Myanmar. Okay, again, I'm sorry with the yellow choice here. It was a bad idea. So essentially, Stalin had a view of ethnicity, and the Soviet, that got institutionalized in Soviet ethnic policy. This then was borrowed by China. When China's communist revolution happened, it in turn was adopted by Vietnam later when it too had a communist revolution. So the Stalinist view of ethnicity has modern implications today and is reflected in the language dynamics. Laos is an extremely interesting and odd country. It sort of does everything its own way. Thailand is a little bit easier to get your head around in some ways. Cambodia doesn't recognize any ethnic minorities whatsoever, so it's really kind of unreconstituted, colonial in its attitude towards its indigenous populations. This is internal neocolonialism manifested writ large here. So basically, what is a Stalinist view of ethnicity? It essentially says that you got to have a separate language, a separate area, a separate culture, and a separate mindset, whatever that means. Okay. Now, in Southeast Asia, this separate culture is usually manifested by separate ways of dressing and separate ways of cooking foods, okay? So you might have like theme parks, like essentially ethno-zoos of a sort, where people like dress up in their traditional clothes and produce traditional food, and then the majority population comes and visits them. I mean, that's why I call them ethno-zoos. I mean, that's essentially what they are, all right? So they, it's not, I'm sorry, I'm not going to be nice or politically correct when I'm calling these people out for what they're doing. It is what it is, okay? All right, so this is Southeast Asia as a whole, lots and lots of languages there. This is the Southeast Asia language hotspot. This one is actually done by language family, so there's a bunch of different language families there. So overall, we essentially find this scenario happening. We find a state language, and then large officially recognized ethnic languages, and then the smaller official ethnic languages, and then the unofficial languages, okay? This is a pattern we see over and over in these countries. One thing to keep in mind here is that verticality plays a role. So the higher up in the mountains your community lives, the more devalued you're likely to be. The closer to doing acceptable Southeast Asian paddy rice cultivation in flatlands, the more likely you are to be accepted and more valued, because you're closer culturally to the majority population's cultural practices. Religion plays a role in some of these as well. Now, so generally speaking, outside of the ethno-zoos and certain festivals, they want people to assimilate, but they like to promote their sort of tolerance through these festivals and things. So we'll see that there's three things that pervade the way the state treats the minority peoples. One is infantilization, so the state is the parent, the minorities are children that need to be taken care of. There's also a really creepy, overt sexualization of the minority women in particular. So there's a kind of creepy paternalistic, maybe creepy uncle or something, state and attractive young niece dynamic that's promoted. And then they basically want to freeze them for state purposes in a particular historical state, not want them to progress on their own ways unless they're progressing towards assimilation. Okay. So some of the numbers here. So China has 55 official recognized minorities, has at least 250 actual languages. Probably the most absurd one is the E nationality, which has 18 distinct groups subsumed under it. Some of them aren't even that related. Gaoshan, incidentally, subsumes all of the Austronesian languages of Taiwan, which aren't very closely related to each other at all. So they have a lot of issues with their official minorities versus the reality on the ground of language spoken. Here's an example of the kind of infantilization and also the sort of fetishization of dress. They're often children produced on, they look like children on maps, and this is a more, reasonable map of China. You see Mandarin occupies large areas. There's other Chinese down here in the south, and then the minority areas are sort of on the periphery. That's how China's map works. All right, this is a very common thing you see about celebrating the indigenous peoples of China. They're all in their colorful dress. If you did a head count here, you'd see there's about 5-to-1 women to men. So it's almost always representations of young women that you see, sometimes older women, but the skewing towards women across this part of Asia towards the representation of minorities is striking. This one's got more men, but again, it has more women than men. Okay, Vietnam is a little bit closer to reality. They have 55 official versus 90 plus real languages. This is a language map of Vietnam. The orange there is essentially Vietnamese. Well, here you go, Miss Hill Tribe contest. There's no Mr. Hill Tribe contest, incidentally. Laos, like I said, is off on its own planet in a lot of ways. They have 3 official groups. They basically are lowland Lao, midland Lao, upland Lao. So they're all Lao in the mind. Laos, on the other hand, has a fairly weak sense of national identity. It's still emerging. Let me just do, here are Hill Tribe. This is a promotional of Hill Tribes of Laos. These are actually all women. The one person you might not think is a woman is the one in green with the pipe, but that's an older woman. Okay, I'll finish up here before the break just with Cambodia briefly. So 0 recognized minorities, but there's about 25 languages there. This is a map of Cambodia's language, so it's not quite so egregious as some of the other places. But they can still, despite having no recognition of indigenous minority groups, as they can still sexually exploit them in their images for tourist promotion. Oh, I'll do Thailand too. Thailand's quick. All right, Thailand's actually much closer to reality, like what's recognized versus not. This has changed quite recently, I think in part due to a secure national identity, which has been crystallized in some ways around the success of the Thai national soccer team, which has promoted a Thai sense of identity across the country. So sports is important. But here we go again. Here's another tourist ethnotourism thing. It's, of course, a young woman makeup. So this is for the Padang group. We'll stop here, and we'll continue with a completely different scenario on Burma, because things are changing now. So I will let anyone, do they have a break, or we do questions, or what do we do? Okay, we'll do questions at the end. So you guys have the break that you want, and I'll see you in a few minutes.
All right, if we can find our seats. If you lost them.
Okay, well, we were, just to remind you, talking about sort of neo-nationalist ecologies of language endangerment. And before we leave Southeast Asia, we have one more country to talk about, which shows some of the similar things, but if you know anything about this country, you won't be surprised to learn that it does things its own way, really oddly, okay? So this is the country we call in English variably Burma or Myanmar. So those two words are actually the same, Myanmar and Burma. They're two different varieties of the same word, okay? A lot of languages in Asia have a kind of high or court style and like a low kind of, non-court style. And these belong to that. So the Bama group is the majority group. One of the weird things about this country is that there's 135 official ethnicities, but there's really only 120 or so languages. So why on earth are there more more than the actual number? And this is because Ne Win, who was the longtime dictator of Burma, was obsessed with numerology, as many Burmese people are, and for him, 9 and 5 were special numbers, and numbers that were multiples of 9 and 5, where the digits added up to 9, were extra special, okay? So 135 was an auspicious number of languages to have in your community, not 120, all right? This is, amongst other things, led to, during his reign, the fact that they issued 45 chot notes, because 45, and 90 chot notes, and also I couldn't find one, but 180 chot notes, okay? So like 45, 90, 180 are odd currency denominations, okay? They make perfect sense in the context of Burma, but only in Burma does that make sense. So now we're going to turn to a slightly different version of nationalist ecologies, and that's what we find in Philippines and Indonesia. So here, rather than there being an actual majority language, there's essentially a constructed language that has been deemed a national language. Now, in the case of the Philippines, it's really Tagalog rebranded Filipino, okay? So it really was one of the national big languages, just rebranded. In the case of Bahasa Indonesia, it was what we called High Malay, so not Bazar Malay, not Low Malay, but High Malay, rebranded as Bahasa Indonesia. And then these languages are promoted through the state educational systems and things. So basically we have a similar hierarchy that we've seen. We have the national language, then we have various large languages that are spoken, and then the smaller ones. And then in the Philippines, you have, in the highlands, in Luzon Island, you have some so-called Negrito populations, so they're darker skinned. And these, unsurprisingly, from what we've been talking about, are the lowest, sort of lower valued groups. There's also a bunch of different things that go into this valuation. One is center versus periphery, so the closer to the sort of center versus the periphery, urban versus rural. As I said, lowland versus upland. You also have a religious hierarchy in the Philippines. Christian language speakers are more valued over Muslim language speakers. And then the sort of standard, typical Filipino-looking Austronesian physical type versus the Negrito physical type. So there's all these different hierarchies at play. And, you know, this is just some of the big languages of the Philippines, so there are some decent-sized ones. And this is what sort of distribution of that, the large languages of the Philippines looks like. It's just another way of looking at it also here. This is just to remind you what that scale is. So there's, you know, there aren't that many endangered languages in the Philippines yet, so implementation of policies to help them, it will still be quite successful there. Turning now to Indonesia. Indonesia is a country with over 700 languages. Okay, it is other than Papua New Guinea, it's number 2 in the world. And it spans a large area and also very diverse area. Some of the big languages spoken in this country include these. I already mentioned Javanese, but there's some other Sundanese, Madurese. Some of these are pretty big languages, okay? So here we have a very similar hierarchy to what we saw in the Philippines, again with the Bahasa at the top, and then these larger languages, and then the sort of smaller ones, and then the Papuan languages at the bottom. So part of Indonesia, the easternmost part of Indonesia, is on the island of New Guinea. So half the country, half the island of New Guinea belongs to the country called Papua New Guinea, and the western half belongs to Indonesia. Okay, so we have the same types of hierarchies going on here. The difference is that Indonesia is a Muslim majority state, so they rank Muslim-speaking communities over Christian-speaking ones, but we still have this religious hierarchy. They still have the urban, rural, upland, lowland, and also the racial phenotypes of sort of more Indonesian-y looking versus darker-skinned peoples, and the Papuan people are very dark. And as I mentioned before, Bahasa Indonesia is essentially a rebranded language that was a Malay variety. So Malaysian and Indonesian are basically the same language. They're just, you know, locally different. One of the interesting things that the hierarchies in Indonesia show is that you often have these very complicated chains of shift. So the lower on the hierarchy shifting to a language immediately above it, and then meanwhile that language might be shifting to the language hierarchy one immediately above it. Okay, so Rongga here is on the 4th rank, and it's shifting to this Warena. Warena is shifting to Manggarai, which is one of these larger languages. Manggarai speakers who were upwardly mobile, meanwhile, are shifting to Bahasa Indonesia. Okay, so we have these interesting changes. So the hierarchies are real. They show some of the dynamics that are going on in terms of like actual language use. So here again, we have a bunch of different ones, but overall, remember, 4 is endangered. So between locally endangered and endangered, so still not so bad. So again, Indonesia can be, you know, things could happen in Indonesia to help a lot of the languages there still. All right, now we're going to talk about India. I've done a lot of work in India, so this is a country I know very well, speak several of these tribal languages that I'll be mentioning here. So in India, you have the concept of development, and the development are state actions that are attempting to help improve the lives seen through a Hindu majority lens to the so-called primitive tribal people who essentially deviate from Hindu norms in various ways. The neo-colonial aspect of India is interesting because majority people in India, and by this I mean sort of Hindi-speaking Hindu populations, celebrate their post-colonial reality. They've shed the British. And what's happened, however, is that, if you know anything about what's happening in India right now, Modi's policies are all about Hindu nationalism and promoting a sort of Hindi sphere, Hindu nationalist agenda to the expense of everybody else, okay? And so Muslims are at risk, the Christian populations are at risk, and the tribal populations who are largely animists or Buddhist or Christian or some other, you know. So what does tribal mean? Okay, so tribal is a really nebulous term in India. But it is something that is in the Constitution, and it consists of indication of primitive traits, whatever that means, distinctive culture, again, whatever that means, shyness of contact with the community at large, that is Hindu majority people, geographic isolation, and backwardsness. So these are not terms that lend to discrimination or bias in any way, of course. And also entirely nebulous and unquantifiable. The area that I'll be talking about here are the Munda language family. So these are languages that most of the relatives are actually in Southeast Asia, but this is the westernmost group that's spoken in India. And I've worked on the majority of these, in fact, pretty much all of these languages. Sora here in the corner recently submitted a 1,200-page grammar to a publisher. So, we're doing extensive documentation work in this area, me and my colleagues. The sexual exploitation or representation of the tribal people is pretty common. So this is an incredibly dry book that I read called Participatory and Sustainable Development Among the Didai. The Didai speak the language called Gita, and this is the photo they chose to put on the front, of course. Primitive tribes of Orissa. There is a man hidden in the background, but otherwise the women are in the foreground. Here's the Encyclopedia of Primitive Tribes in India. It's as if there are no men in this community. Okay. So again, like we saw in Southeast Asia, the main state purpose is to assimilate these people, except for when they can show how broad-minded the state is by having these cultural fairs where they have them come out in their traditional clothes, maybe do a dance, and then, go back and toil away, for the most of the time. So this is a quote by Peter Berger. Yes, they oppress their backwardsness when it's useful to them celebrating their diversity. Okay, so India, is arguably the most linguistically hierarchical state in the world. It has 7 different levels. We saw 3 and 4 going on, maybe 5, but there's at least 7 different hierarchical levels. I mean, if you know something about Hindu culture, it's probably not that shocking that they have all these different gradations and different levels of sort of more or less acceptable. So the languages that I work with are all at the bottom. They're all at the 5, 6, and 7. Okay, so those are the ones that I work with. So this is just a map of the Indian language hotspot. So just some contextualization of so-called development schemes. So after 30 years, the reported literacy among the Gata people for men went from 1.5% to 12.6%, and for females from 0.0% to 3.4%. So 30 years of educational development and getting up to 3% literacy is not a great rate, okay? And incidentally, these numbers are BS, okay? Are like very, very close to not anybody in these communities who are literate, all right? So teacher absenteeism is really common. So they pretend they're there, but they're not. One of the most endangered knowledge areas that we see cross-linguistically around the world is plant knowledge. So traditional plant knowledge is something that is highly developed in many cultures, but is at extreme risk. There's a rapidly urbanizing communities, and so traditional plant knowledge is at risk. And it turns out the Gata has a very interesting internal system that was very relevant to their culture, but is not aligned with, Linnaean botanical taxonomy. I'm very interested in ethnobotany. I've written a book on this amongst the beer whore people. So I find I love plants. I'm a big vegetable cultivator myself. So plants I have a thing for. So sorry. So they have a suffixal classification system in this language. So this is the one little bit of linguistics we'll get into here, okay? So this che suffix, che means it has economic value, could be used for food or for construction, okay? So there's a plant, mamoche, tumbache, tikache, Okay, here's a couple more. Now, bug is another suffix very specific to this community. It means they use it to feed their pigs. Pigs are very important for them, okay? They also use this themselves, and so this has both bug and che in it. De means it's related to water. It grows on or near water, and che means it has some function. So this one has two suffixes, de and che. Rat means it's thorny, spiky, poisonous, or dangerous. Okay, so that's a useful thing to know. But the word tells you, you probably shouldn't touch that or eat it. So we have some, but you can see that, like, this is a very different type of plant than this, but they're both rat. Okay, hot means they use it in fishing. Fishing is also very important for these people. So you have, this one has hot. Again, you have hot. Here we have lead or creepers. They traditionally made rope out of the creepers, so this was a specific economic use. And then rat. So this one is both the rope, so it's usable for rope, so it's useful, but it's also dangerous, so it has rat. So you have rat. Sar means the flower is of some note. Sar is a flower. So, okay. Just to summarize Asia before we move on, these different ecologies with the extreme settlement colonialism in Siberia, the average level of endangerment is 1.9. So that's between moribund and seriously endangered, so bad. A little bit more recent settlement colonies with a slightly different ecology that we found in Taiwan and the Ryukyus, it's more 3.3. So again, it's below endangered. It's between seriously endangered and endangered. So it's not good. In Southeast Asia and Western Australasia, Indonesia, Philippines, we see it's in the just above 4 point something range. So between endangered and locally endangered. So again, the green ones are a little bit more likely to have stuff be able to happen. Now in India, it's still pretty good. So we're still not so bad. The shift is happening now. Is starting to happen now as these development schemes get more and more pronounced. So keep in mind, compulsory education only became a law in India in 2014. Okay, so this is, and in a lot of rural areas, it's not widely followed even today. Okay, so, this, once that expands, that's gonna change these numbers pretty drastically for sure, because these languages are not used as mediums of instruction. You will always have the state language. This was just summarizing it within the ecologies. Essentially, the things we see in Southeast Asia are this kind of religious and verticality, but that's also applies in India for the most part. Official versus non-official minorities and stuff. These are all just to summarize the sort of political, those are all political issues, the political dynamics that are social attitudinal dynamics that play into this. This is just summarizing Asia as a whole. Now, Indonesia skews this because it's very close to the Indonesian numbers, because Indonesia has so many languages that the numbers are a little skewed towards Indonesia's numbers. This is just to see the different ones compared. I didn't put Taiwan in here, sorry. Now this is just comparing them to some of the other ones we're going to look at. The Asian ones are in bold. The thing to note here is Siberia is really truly dismal. It's even worse than Australia or North America. And those are pretty bad, okay? And we're going to talk about them in a second. But before we do that, we're going to talk about some trade and exploitation colonies. And here we have a triglossic situation. So that's a fancy word for saying 3 languages at play, okay? And often you have the official language, which is a colonial language, okay? But the actual language that's being shifted to is the middle one, is the second one. And then all of the ones below that are the vast majority of these indigenous languages. Now that middleman language, as I mentioned, is often a Creole language. So we'll first talk about Equatorial Africa. And so here is a broad map of the different language families of Africa. Basically, you see the languages related to Arabic in blue, and then you've got this just variety of ones in yellow in the middle, which the so-called Nilo-Saharan family. And then in the green, you have the click languages. And then the Madagascar is Austronesian, so that's like basically the western edge of the Pacific in a way, even though it's the western edge of the Indian Ocean. Then the orange and red ones orange is Bantu. So Bantu alone is just a subgroup of what's called the Niger-Congo language family, which all the rest of the things in red are. But Bantu has over 500 languages, so it's a very large and internally diverse group. But they came out of West Africa and spread across most of the rest of Africa some few thousand years ago. This is a language density map of the endangered languages, again, using the same color coding. Red and orange are more endangered, green and yellow less endangered. So again, in Africa, we're not dealing with significant levels of endangerment yet. Okay, so but that doesn't mean that there aren't a lot of languages at risk. And in particular, in Nigeria, in northern Nigeria, in the Hausa sphere, Hausa has been the vector of the spread of Islam rather than Arabic in that part of the world. And the Hausa language is rapidly replacing other languages in northern Nigeria. And there are hundreds of languages in that area, so it's going to make a huge impact eventually, and already has. This is just, again, this type of map, but this is color-coded by language family. The yellow, in this case, unlike that other map, blue is Nilo-Saharan and yellow is Afro-Asiatic related to Arabic. And then red is the Niger-Congo, and green at the bottom is the click languages. All right, so Nigeria, where I've spent some time and done some field work. This is so the Hausa here, you see the big Hausa sphere in the north, and some of those other yellow languages are languages related to Hausa, like Bole and Bura, Bata. So these are, roughly speaking, the distribution of the different language families in Nigeria. My colleague, Bolanle Orakoyo there, who's recently made the first female professor of linguistics in Nigeria at Ilorin University, she has compiled several dictionaries. This was her at the launch event of this book we published in the Olokumi. So it's the first ever documentation of this language called Olokumi. So, as I just mentioned, in addition to the trade exploitation colony of Equatorial Africa, we have the majority of Equatorial Africa, but specifically I'm thinking about Cameroon and Nigeria, because Cameroon's, there's about 570 so languages in Nigeria, another 300 in Cameroon. So that's where the most of the languages are spoken in Africa, as in Cameroon and Nigeria. But we do have the Nuba Hills, which I mentioned before, as a settlement colony, and also the desert southwest of northern South Africa. But there are also some neo-nationalist ecologies going on in specific places in Africa. So Ethiopia, I mentioned earlier. It's also true in Botswana and Senegal. So they have a slightly different dynamic there. So Ethiopia, it's the Amharic language that's being spread, though it is not the largest language. The largest language in Ethiopia is called Oromo, which is related to Somali. And Botswana is the Setswana language, which is a Bantu language. And then in Senegal, the Wolof language is the language that is being promoted. All right, this is just a map of Ethiopia. It still remains a fairly linguistically diverse area. That big yellow is where Oromo is, basically, and a couple of small languages related to it. So the green is essentially Amharic in the handful of languages. So in Ethiopia, I should mention that it has a religious undertone. The Amharic speakers are generally Christian, and the Oromos are usually Muslim, and then these people in the southwest border tend to be animists. So, okay, now we're going to turn to the sort of most canonical trade exploitation colony, that's Melanesia. Melanesia is like a really, really fascinating place, and I've
had 11 field trips to Papua New Guinea and 2 to Vanuatu, so I'm pretty familiar with the area. It's unlike any other place on Earth. You definitely feel like you're on another planet at times in Papua New Guinea. Their social dynamics are very, very different than anywhere else. So anyway, there are over 850 languages spoken in New Guinea. This shows the whole island of New Guinea, but I'm talking about the eastern half of this island has 850 languages. There's more than 1,000 languages spoken on the island of New Guinea. And they belong to many different language families. Okay, there is one large language family, kind of like the Indo-European of New Guinea, if you will, called Trans-New Guinea. It's kind of a dumb name, but that's what it's called. It has, probably 60% of the languages, but this is me working in East Sepik province with a speaker of Yokoim language. These are 2 other speakers from the South Highlands province listening to a recording. We've also done a fair bit of work in Medang province. As you can see, the coastal areas have ridiculous numbers of languages. So people usually attribute the linguistic diversity of New Guinea to the extremely mountainous nature of the terrain, but the mountainous area of New Guinea has very large languages, and the coastal area has many, many fractured languages that have no barriers, no physical barriers. So it's social barriers in New Guinea, not physical barriers that mainly trigger the linguistic diversification there. And mentioned the Austronesian expansion out of Taiwan. Well, one of the first places they went was northern New Guinea, okay? And so there was a bunch of Papuan speakers there, and then some of these coastal areas got interspersed with different Austronesian communities. So that added a new layer of diversity that wasn't originally there. So we worked on this language called Matugar, or the village is called Matugar. They call the language Panau. Panau is an Austronesian language, and it literally means "give it to me." And the theory that they say, like, why do you call your language Panau? They said, well, they're aware of the fact that they came there and said, yeah, we liked this village area. It's this beautiful beach. So we said to the people that were living there, Panau, and we took it. So that's their own. So it's assuredly apocryphal, but it's a nice story. This is a language which, like many languages, has very specialized vocabulary relevant to their culture. In this case, canoes. They have, you can see, unanalyzable words, all one syllable here, that detail the different parts of the canoes. So canoes are clearly important to this culture. That's what you can take away from this graphic. So I mentioned that the languages that are the replacing languages are basically Creoles. Creoles usually start out as Pidgins. Pidgins are interlanguages. They're incomplete language systems that are sort of temporarily exist to get a bridge between 2 groups that don't have one language. When you get native speakers emerging out of this area, the whole grammar fills out. So they're fully developed languages that basically take most of the vocabulary from one language, and then, but they have a totally inherent logic. So Tokpisin is a Creole language. So grass means grass, but it also means lots of other things, okay? So anyone want to venture what grass belong face means? It's a beard, yeah. Or grass belong dog. That's dog hair, okay, right. So you can see that grass has a wide, what we call polysemy in linguistics. It has a large range of meanings. Okay, so just to wrap up the Pacific, Australia is a classic settlement colony. At contact, this was something like the representation of the languages in the area. One of the interesting things about Australia is that the northern part of Australia, which was at some point adjacent to New Guinea, has 26 of the 27 language families that are spoken in Australia, and the entire rest of the continent has 1. So there was a big expansion that may have happened with at least in tandem with the arrival of the dingo, which happened around 5,000 or 6,000 years ago, and then this area, which is roughly the equivalent of the Indo-European language expansion. So Indo-European was in some
place in the Caucasus or southern Ukraine or something, and then expanded out across the whole rest of the world, essentially over 6,000 years, right? So similar thing happened, except for it was Australia with this one group called the Pama-Nyungan group. All right, this is a somewhat more accurate representation of where you find. So again, in the northern and western and central deserts, that central part is real desert area, like Alice Springs area and stuff. That's so these are where you find the indigenous groups still speaking their languages a little bit more. The other areas around Sydney and Melbourne, exactly, they're all gone basically. There's a lot of revitalization going on and stuff in Australia. So this is an even probably more accurate version, so it's pretty minimal. Keep in mind that this map basically refers to English speakers and then speakers of immigrant languages, because the total population of Aboriginal Australian languages is quite small still. Okay, so it's not like there's 43% of the Northern Territory there are indigenous speakers. That's not true. Okay, there's a lot of Indonesian speakers there, for example. So yeah, Chinese speakers also, large numbers of Chinese speakers in Australia. Okay, so now we're going to come back home. We're going to talk a little bit about the Northwest and Salish experience. So I'll tell you why I'm talking about Salish in a second. So roughly speaking, this is the Western North America language hotspot, which includes, basically most of the Western U.S. from Oklahoma out here, and it includes Canada as well. There are some sub-areas we can differentiate. So the upper plains, the southwest, the northwest Pacific Plateau, where we are here in California, northern Mexico. So in the upper plains in the southwest, most languages are endangered, and in the North Pacific Plateau in California, northern Mexico, most of them are severely endangered or moribund, okay? So they're slightly better off in like the Pueblos and stuff like that than they are here in Oregon, for example. Here is a contact period map of the Pacific Northwest. So a large number of different languages. We'll see a couple more maps here. This is southwestern Canada, so we're looking at BC basically, and this one, like the Siberian map, shows the sort of fracturing into single villages where the languages are maintained, again, from different language families. Again, this is an idealized contact version of Alaska. Now, Alaskan languages belong mainly to the Dene family. There are a couple of other ones, and then there's a few Eskimo Aleut languages as well. This is a slightly more realistic version of that same map for contemporary purposes. This is, the left part is the top north, and you can see the light blue part is where it joins, is the southern part of the coastal part running from Alaska down British Columbia. The colors are basically showing different language families. This is another version essentially of the same map. Most of the southern part of that area and then into Washington and then dipping down into Oregon belong to the Salish language family, which I'll talk about in a second. This is just to give you an example of the broad strokes diversity in the area. So a lot of different language families were spoken here. But it's, again, they're not doing great today. This is a map of Oregon, again, idealized to the time of the period of contact, more or less. There are a lot of language families spoken in Oregon. Oregon was one of the more linguistically diverse places in the world at contact. However, there's been quite a few that have been lost. So we no longer have speakers of most of these languages. The most recent one with Klamath Modoc, which the last speaker died in like 2003 or 2004. So just to give you a bit, Cayuse as the distinction of unfortunately being the first one to go. And then we have the last known speaker passing away in these periods. Getting closer. The 30s obviously wasn't a good time. Some spilled out into the 40s and early, later in 50s, 60s. The most recent one besides Klamath Modoc was the Tillamook language, which last speaker died in 1972. I had the opportunity to work with her son before he passed away again a number of years ago when he was in his 90s. He was the last rememberer of the language. He didn't speak the language, but he remembered it, hearing it, and was certainly, we got to play him his mother's recordings because we have recordings of his mother, and so he got to listen to that, and that was an enjoyable aspect of his life. I've done a bit of work with the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians, and who are they? Well, they're like many of the groups in Oregon, a confederation of 27 different groups. They were the first federally re-recognized group in 1975. But they have all these different groups that we've seen. Part of them, some of these same groups were split and sent to Grand Ronde, but other ones Siletz. But the language that endured into the 21st century was an Athabascan or Dene variety. It's essentially, we had all of these languages spoken in Oregon and the California border in the case of Tolowa. But what survived essentially was something on the Chetka, Tolowa, Tututni set, and then this has been adopted as the language that they're teaching in the schools in Siletz right now. And I helped them build this very massive electronic dictionary that they use in the school. This is the different groups that I just mentioned that are basically have ended up in the CTSI. This is just a screenshot from the dictionary. It has photos, it has audio, etc. And we'll just hear what this language sounds like.
Acorn sifter basket.
Whoops, that was Bud Lane, the now retired former language officer there.
File.
You can hear the glottalization there and stuff, so it's a kind of typical Dene language sound. Okay, so we're going to finish up with a little bit of talk on the Salish language family. So the southernmost Salish language was in Oregon, that is the Tillamook, but mainly it was a Washington State and British Columbia group. I was bringing it up because it was the first languages that I worked on when I was still a student. So they always have a special place in my heart. There's a lot of name issues. So sometimes you have older names and newer names. Sometimes you have names that are easier for English speakers to pronounce, and then the real name, like the Klallam, which is actually which I wouldn't recommend trying to say too many times quickly. Some of the groups have multiple different names, so that can be confusing. But there's a bunch of groups anyway, and a bunch of names. This is the Salish. There's some interior ones. We're down in this area. I'll just go through this. Again, this is a different map showing the Salish language family. So what are they like? Well, Nuxalk, which is from southern British Columbia, or southern I'd say, has some real tongue twisters here, like words that have nothing but consonants. Okay, so that's the word for rope. Language. Okay, it's creaking. So yeah, they like consonants. They don't like vowels very much in that language. This is just some of the other colonies. This is out of sequence, so I'm sorry, this slide should be a couple ones later. But anyway, these are just some of the other settlement colonies in the New World. So Amazonia is experiencing the settlement colony now, again, like we saw with Sudan. So this is why there's a lot of issues going on in these communities now. Like first contact has happened in some of these cases in the 2000s, and then the Great Death that always follows first contact as these people were exposed to microorganisms they didn't have any natural defenses against. So there was a group in Brazil that was contacted in, I think, like 2003 called Akunsu. They're down to 6 members of the ethnic group now. So this is just what happens. It sucks, but it's what it is. So language documentation is, and language revitalization are two ways that people are fighting back, if you will. So we need documentation in order to do revitalization. So language documentation essentially means recording and developing materials that are of some use. Now, strictly speaking, most documentation materials are used for and by linguists, but then there's language revitalization materials which are for the purposes of the communities. Okay, so that's it's the data is the same, it's the application that differs essentially, if you will. Some are more scientific, some are more applied. So yeah, you see I put a couple of these out of, but yeah, so all is not lost. So even languages, as I mentioned, that have no speakers can have resources developed if there's an interest to be able to try to bring it back, okay? As long as there's recordings. So we have to get the recordings and make the data, available. But what we do find is that when you have strong community engagement, then, things are can really happen. Things can really go quickly, and because the Siletz have done a great job of they have a lot of, semi-speakers, but they're really generating a lot of good materials and data, like they have plays and like the kids do stuff now in the language, and so it's really doing a great job. So like I said, these revitalization and maintenance are essentially a continuum. If it's further towards no longer being spoken or isn't spoken, then revitalization, and maintenance would be if it's slightly better off. So here's an example of a booklet published in one of those Salish languages I was mentioning. Yeah, we talked about this a little bit earlier, but immersion schools are very useful. It's like basically the most proven way to do language revitalization is, but you need to train teachers and other things. So it's complicated and requires funding, but it works. It definitely works. Like we have data that shows that works. It will help generate speakers. Little kids are little sponges, right? They will learn. You put a 3-year-old in a language environment, they're going to learn the language. So yeah, community engagement is really key, and in these days and age, digital resources are necessary, especially to keep kids engaged. As we move into the latter half of the 2020s, AI will be an important thing. And we're working right now on a tool that is worked with our Living Dictionary program, which is going to help create all kinds of things like agentive AIs in lots of different languages. So we're not there yet, but we'll get there. 5 years from now we'll be it. But just last little bit of, here's a now no longer spoken language, once spoken in Oregon. This is Tillamook. You can see the modern digital recordings sound a little better than the old school analog ones. We'll hear a couple more here. Some of these are pretty good. That one was kind of rough.
Tiki,
The Sally.
the Sally,
So this was the last known speaker of this language.
Mama Hustachi, Alaska.
Okay, so one of the things I mentioned was this Living Dictionary, and this is this multimedia tool that we've been working on for a number of years. They were originally called talking dictionaries. Some people had problems with that as a term, so we changed it to living dictionaries, because they're living products. They're things that are never finished. They're supposed to be continually added to and updated by the communities and things. And they allow for remote collaboration also, so they're very helpful. That certainly during the pandemic, they were very useful. We could do a lot of work. We didn't have to cut down anything. Couldn't go into the communities anymore, but we could still work with them. And so I showed you, this is from New Guinea. This is this Matagar Panau language. And it allows collective elicitation, which is in the Pacific and very important, where individuals won't don't want to speak up except for on their very minimal or very restricted knowledge domain that they're comfortable with, and they'll happily give you all those words, but they don't want to ever impinge on somebody else's domain of knowledge, so they won't say anything. So if you're just working with one person, it's not going to work. Whereas if you have a single recorder with a group of people together, that works much better. We've held a number of workshops over the years in different places. This is one that took place in New Guinea and Leh. This is one we did in Micronesia. There's another shot from that one. This one we did in Santiago, Chile, with some Latin American, bunch of different countries people participated in. This one we did in Zimbabwe. And this one was in Northeast India. So in addition to developing resources and tools, the other thing that we need is modern things that appeal to young people, and things like hip-hop music composed in languages is one such thing. It's a new domain of language use. Okay, so that's thank you very much. And that was in a language called Hruso, spoken in northeastern India. There's about 3,000 speakers. So yeah, thank you for indulging that lengthy.
Hi, this is Brenda. I'm from Oklahoma. I have a question about all the Native peoples that were First Peoples that were removed to Oklahoma. Do they have any sense of how many languages were lost from that?
I don't know the exact answer to that. I think there is a sense, but, and one of them, of course, came from here. The Modoc people ended up in Oklahoma. I mean, some obviously, most of them were intact when they were moved. It was when they were there that they started to, that was part of the point, was remove them and crush. So, it was successful in some cases, but there's a lot of good revitalization going on in Oklahoma. So, yeah. Pawnee, I know, is a language that's basically no longer has speakers there relatively recently, but they're still teaching it, so.
Hi, my name's Mark, and you did a great job of explaining how you're using technology to document these languages and keep them alive. Could you speak a little bit more about the role of technology in causing them to go away? I mean, it seems like these things right here, these phones and mass communications, it seems like those are homogenizing influences that...
Right.
Could you talk more about that?
Mike Krause, who worked at the Alaska Native Language Center about 35 years ago, called television cultural nerve gas. And while it wasn't untrue, what it said to me was, we need to be able to try to find a way to flip the dynamic here, okay? Because if it's that powerful a tool, let us use it for good and not for evil. Now, on a corporate, bottom line level, it's relatively unrealistic, but the internet, came into existence essentially and became more and more used, and that sort of is a leveling of the playing field in a way. Now, we are facing this issue with AI, digital divide. So the digital divide exists for real, okay? Yeah, and it does do exactly what you said. It has haves and have-nots. But if you give people in these communities the know-how, that's why we run these workshops, right, is to try to teach people how to do things, then they can create these materials themselves and host them for very cheap now. I mean, it used to be that things used to be really expensive, but now it's like really, really inexpensive to do these types of things on a grassroots level. So if they're for local consumption by grassroots communities, then it can be very useful. But again, we're facing another digital divide with AI, which is precisely why I said we're working on trying to turn these repositories of information that we have, that have audio and video and things, into useful AI tools for people also looking with a eye to the future. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Don. A number of ethnic groups and tribes have oral history, but not written history, and I've always kind of wondered about that. Anyone who's played telephone as a kid, you know, you wonder if the story at the end is anything like it had been earlier. So my question about languages is, if you have someone who's the last living speaker of a language and you go and record him, let's pretend that 25 years or 100 years earlier, there were a number of people who spoke that language, and they're all sitting up in heaven and looking down at this guy that's being recorded. Are they going to say, wow, he really mispronounced that, or
Well,
he doesn't know what that word
okay.
is?
So possibly. All languages change over time. It's unlikely that you would understand a conversation in English from 400 or 500 years ago. So that's so it's just the reality of languages that they change, and they borrow words when they come into new contacts with other languages, et cetera, et cetera. So so on some level, the answer to that assuredly is yes. Also, written history is interpretive and also not necessarily actual facts. So there's don't put too much into the distinction between oral versus written histories either, because they're of dubious lineages often, and they're certainly, as they say, the victors write the histories, right? So much like the same group of people can be considered terrorists or freedom fighters, depending on your perspective, right? And if they come into power, the very same people who were called terrorists by the people in power become freedom fighters in the new regime or whatever, right? So history is interpretive. But yeah, for sure the languages would have changed. I knew a guy who was the last speaker who died a few years ago of Chimweve language, and he used to just talk to himself while he was working in his cleared grass and stuff for the state or maybe the federal government, for some government entity. And he just was once his aunties and grandmother had died, he had no one to talk to, so he just talked to himself to try to keep it up. And it's a burden that people who are in that situation bear. But yeah, assuredly there'll be some differences. But linguists aren't English teachers. Okay, so your English teacher says X is right and Y is wrong. Linguists say X and Y are variants. Okay. So, and we don't care whether one's right or not. That's a political, social thing. Like the linguistic, if I'm speaking, you understand me. What I said is right. Okay, so that's what I mean by that. You got a question here? Yeah, we got it.
Hi, my name is Jim. I was curious about the sort of the nitty-gritty involved in going to far-flung places like you have, and how much prep is involved in terms of understanding what you're aiming for as a goal. And is it totally based on recordings? I used to do this, and it was totally based on transcription because we thought it was more accurate than recordings, which we could do, but back in the 70s, we didn't have that high audio.
Yeah, you'll never ever, you need the instrumentally verified recordings. The phonetics, you'll never get. I've done both ways, but you'll never get the nuances of phonetic sound if you don't have the recordings to go back and listen to. So they supplement each other. I always, of course, take notes immediately while I'm listening to someone speaking. So the prep question, tons of prep, all right? Obsessive amounts of prep. I will literally collect everything ever published or unpublished on these languages and comb through them and get as much grounding as I possibly can in them before I've done that. So that may not be everyone's MO, but that's mine. Yeah. So the more informed you are, the better. So.
Okay. Hi, I'm Lisa. Thank you. This was so informative. But I was wondering, you mentioned that there were more languages on the coast where there are fewer physical barriers.
In New Guinea.
In New Guinea,
yeah.
And more social barriers. What are those social barriers?
Well, they're avoidance cultures for the most part. So they like to, shoot first and don't ask questions later was sort of their policy of interacting with foreigners. If you weren't part of the clan networks, you weren't welcome. Was essentially what it came down to. So, but some groups intermarried, so that was different. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Tom.
Got a guy with a question? No, you can do yours. But got it.
I'm Tom. I think what you're doing is terrific, and I want to thank you for everything you're doing. But I keep on thinking about the fact that if you were addressing a bunch of legislators who are trying to make a decision on funding this kind of research and practice, and what would you say, and this is going to be a devil's advocate question, what would you say to some right-winger, some jerk, anyway, who raised his hand and said, well, why shouldn't everybody speak English? It would make things a lot more simple.
Okay, I would say, why don't you ask the Sumerians what ruling the known world does? Or you could ask the Akkadians who replaced them, or you could ask the Hittites who replaced them. Those languages are all extinct. A zero-sum game mentality assumes that that group will always be in power. So if you have an ideology that's completely subtractive, monolingual ideology, then the only possible response is, I mean, let's just look at the trend of history right now and where things are going. If that's your attitude, I hope it's okay that your grandchildren will be monolingual Mandarin Chinese speakers, because that's where we're going. So good luck with that.
I'm Mark, and I am... In my career, I was always thinking about peak oil. I never thought that it would coincide with peak language. But it's ironic that they're at the same time. But my question is, there are Inupiaq speakers in the western of Alaska, and they have relatives and Inupiaq speakers in Siberia. And is there a different cultural erosion, science-based studies show in the North America versus the Siberian environment?
The Eskimoic speakers in Siberia very likely are a back migration. The whole group came to North America at some point. Now, with the one exception, there's one village where unfortunately the variety is now extinct or dormant, and called Sireniki, which may have been a third branch of, there's two branches of Eskimoic, and it may have been a third branch that stayed there. But the majority of the people that live in like Chaplino or the part that's right over there, in the Chukot Peninsula, that's they could have been back migrants relatively recently, maybe 2,000-3,000 years ago.
That when the red light's is that going to work?
There's a question up here that this guy had a question.
I know, you're going to have to stay and answer that question.
I'm fine.
So on the count of 3, please thank him in another language. 1, 2, 3. Thanks so much.
Yeah, I'll be happy to answer any questions you have afterwards.